Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and it's an honor to rise today in the House and speak for the first time in our new chambers. And it's an honor to get up and speak on such an important bill, one that I think will probably have historic meaning as we go through it. Mr. Speaker, I do not totally support the bill the way it is written. I have concerns with some of the language, but I do appreciate very much the need to bring it before the Heritage Committee and study it as soon as possible. Indigenous languages are so important to our First Nations people. It must be recognized, respected, revitalized, and retained. With over 70 dialogues, this makes this portion of the bill so important, Mr. Speaker. I'm speaking today on this bill because I feel so strongly about the need to protect our heritages. This bill will create an independent commissioner for Indigenous rights, confirm the government's belief that Indigenous language is part of Section 35 of the Charter, and allows the translation of federal services into Indigenous languages. What a wonderful thing. It's been too long. Over 2 years ago, the Liberals promised an Indigenous Language Act. Here we are, just 60 days left in this parliamentary session. It is quite unlikely this legislation will become law before the upcoming fall election, unless we all work together in earnest. Another failed promise by this Liberal government. This is just another portion of the Truth and Reconciliation findings that this government failed. Promised much, but failed to deliver. Promised the language legislation in December of 2016, we're still not there. Promised child welfare legislation by the end of January. Where is it, Mr. Speaker? It will be difficult for any of their Indigenous-related legislation priorities to receive royal assent before the next election. Botched consultation and legislative flaws in Bill S3. Botched consultation on the Trans Mountain Expansion Project. Cancelled the Enbridge Northern Gateway Project without consulting the bands who had equity agreements signed. Brought in the tanker ban without consulting the pro-energy First Nation groups of the West Coast. Missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls inquiry, stuck in bureaucratic red tape, extended its time, commissioners resigned, and nearly 30 staffers left or quit. 3 non-compliance orders regarding Human Rights Tribunal rulings on First Nations child welfare since they've been in government. And one of the most important is gutting the First Nations Financial Transparency Act. Mr. Speaker, that's about as far as I'm going with my partisan attack against this government. What I want to speak about now, I want to focus on the tradition and heritage of the Aboriginal people. I was fortunate through my working career to have spent my service in Aboriginal policing. I got to understand and appreciate the differences of the different groups, such as the Shuswap Nations, the Dakota Nations, the Chananura First Nations, the Dene, the Cree, Slavey. I made many friends over the years, and I spent a lot of my off time when I wasn't working as a police officer socializing with my Aboriginal friends and associates. My wife Nancy and I loved going to Aboriginal gatherings, such as Taylor on the Peace River, the Petatot River Gathering in the Northwest Territories, the Paul Band in my riding of Yellowhead. In these surroundings, you really get to know and understand the importance of the heritage of our Aboriginal people. Mr. Speaker, I remember back in the 1980s when I used to travel Highway 77 that ran from north of Fort Nelson, BC, into the Northwest Territories. It was part of my patrol area. I was the detachment commander at the Fort Nelson detachment at the time. And I used to go over there quite often. I used to stop at what we call traditional native camps along the highway, where the Denny people of the Liard River Band would move from their homes on the reserve and take their families and move out onto the land, set up temporary shelters, and live in their old traditional ways. It was their way of teaching the young ones how it was and how important their heritage was. And probably the only times they would speak English while they stayed there for the full summer, Mr. Speaker, was when I arrived, because I do have a grasp of the languages, but not enough to have a good conversation. And they would tell me why they were there. And it was so good to see those young children learning about their history and learning how to live off the land and keeping their heritage alive. As I said, they focused on speaking their native tongues. It was so good to see these kids speaking that way. And they wouldn't speak to their parents in English when I was there, only if they were talking to me directly. Mr. Speaker, I am of Ukrainian descent, and my grandfathers, both sides, came over from the Ukraine in the late 1800s. You know, they settled as farmers in northeastern Alberta. Both raised large families, who in turn raised families, who I am the third descendant of that. But you know, over the years, when they both came here, one of my grandfathers could speak English and the other could only speak Ukrainian. And both of my grandmothers could only speak Ukrainian. But over the years, they learned how to speak English. And as my parents' generation, the second generation, grew up, they spoke more and more English in the schools. And in fact, very similar to our residential schools, they were forbidden to speak Ukrainian while in school. They were punished. They'd get the yardstick, they might get the strap. So they were encouraged to learn the English language. And sadly, we saw our language slowly get lost as people began to speak English more and more and more. And this is what we're talking about today in this Bill C-91, the loss of the Indigenous languages. You know, we have 11 major dialogues and 70-some different forms, and it's so important, and this is why this bill is so important, that we work together to get it passed. We haven't got much time. But we need to protect those because the people are getting older that know it. As someone said earlier, the live dictionaries are getting older. You know, I wish I could speak my native tongue, because like so many people, I want to go back and research my heritage. I want to go back to the Ukraine to see where my grandfathers came from, in order to get a better understanding of why I'm here today. Now, Mr. Speaker, I mentioned I spent a lot of time in my working life, and I've met some very special Aboriginal people. We have become friends and acquaintances. But we only have 60 days left, and that wouldn't be enough time for me to sit here and tell you about the great Aboriginal people I've met over the years, and the interesting stories I have about them, and the things that they have done that I would like to tell you about. We just don't have enough time, and 60 days wouldn't be enough. What I'm going to do, though, is talk about two of them. The inside was white, and on the top of it, they had a garlic sausage. And so we mixed our cultures. We learned our cultures together over the years as I was stationed there. You know, in many communities across Canada, we have our places called friendship centers, where the Aboriginal people living in urban centers gather and encourage the community to come and visit with them to learn their ways and their culture. So it's so very important that we recognize that, and if you have a friendship center in your area, visit it. You'll find it very amazing, the work they do in the urban centers of Canada. And in just closing, have I got any more time, Mr. Speaker? I'm done? Okay, I'll close off then. Thank you.
We have time just for one short question and response. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Canadian Heritage.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and my friend opposite expressed a great deal of concern about the timeline, and it seemed almost as though that he was giving up on the process already. We still have 13 weeks to go in this Parliament, and I believe that all of us here, if we work together, we can get this legislation through, and many others. So I want to ask the member what his commitment is to make sure that this legislation gets through both the House as well as the Senate, and if he can assist us in making sure that his Senate colleagues also work with us on this.
For Yellowhead.
Thank you. Through you, Mr. Speaker. You know, I asked a question earlier to the minister that spoke if she was willing to cooperate and work with the opposition parties. And I can tell you, in listening to the conversations that my colleagues in the NDP, my colleagues here, and listening to a number of you across, I think we're all ready to get going on this. It's just a matter, let's throw a lot of the partisanship aside. Let's get something that is very, very important to the Aboriginal communities of this country. Let's get it done. We've got 60 days. We can do it. We'll do it together.